Take the quiz, prompts the canny pop-up questionnaire on Tate.org's website. Which art collective do you belong to? Should you be in the Black Audio Film Collective, or are you a hackney flasher at heart? The test refers to a pair of London-based artist groups from the 1970s and 1980s. One focused on the British African diaspora, Black Audio Collective, the other foregrounding working women's rights through photography and public posters, the Hackney Flashers. More questions immediately follow. What makes up your collective? What is your mission all about? What inspires you? A click, a pause, and like a vintage coin-operated fortune-telling machine, the platform's algorithm reveals your innermost communal proclivities. And somehow, I wound up belonging to the 19th century painting circle known as the Ancients, who gathered at the home of poet William Blake. Don't ask me how. Scrolling down the page, we find information about how to start a movement, in quotes, how to start a movement, along with short biographies of other, quote, radical art groups. A large button then leads to a £5 membership deal offering discounted tickets and 29% off cafe items puckishly marketed under the brand Tate Collective. I don't want to overstate this next point, and nor do I wish to proclaim that the art world has finally begun to shift away from its adoration of individual authorship towards cooperative forms of production, but the very fact that one of the institutional pillars of high culture is endorsing, however waggishly, collective artistic agency indicates a marked degree of change towards socialized art practices previously relegated, if they appeared at all, to the basement archives. Tate Inc. is not unique in this regard. Before this past year, would it have been possible for Black Lives Matter to top the annual ranking of 100 art world influencers as preferred by the Art Review magazine, online journal, British, in 2020, with the Me Too movement, hashtag Me Too movement, in fourth place, close behind? A primary question I will explore today, therefore, is why this embrace of socially engaged and activist art now? Which is to say that before, those of us, including many who are presenting in this series, who have sought for many years to add critical weight to these practices, take what appears to be a well-deserved victory lap. Let us stop to acknowledge that contradictions around issues of fair labor, racial representation, gender equality, and the decolonial politics all remain present within the mainstream art world today. For example, just 1 year after the Tate Corporation uploaded its "Which Art Collective Do You Belong To?" questionnaire, more than 100 of its employees went on a labor strike to protest the institution's massive job-cutting measures, allegedly brought about by the COVID SARS-2 epidemic. I'm certain that most, if not all, of the groups listed on the Tate's pop-up quiz would have joined the picket line in solidarity if they were around today. But one significant change from the 1970s is the way these contradictions have become virtually impossible to hide away from the public or from the press. And more importantly, the institutions themselves appear incapable of managing these conflicts, not without drawing high-profile reprisals from artists, as we shall see. So let's dig a bit deeper into this curious parlay, uneasy parlay, that has taken place between a cautious brace of social practice art by the established art world on one hand, and the social discontent felt by so many art world constituents and their allies on the other hand. This is not a new phenomenon, of course. In 1971, Hans Hake's solo exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum was canceled, ostensibly over a few works explicitly tracing New York City's unscrupulous real estate market using data drawn from municipal archives, public archives. Like some art world epidemiologists, the Guggenheim's director, Thomas M. Messer, claimed he was duty-bound to block Hawke's work because it was, quote, an alien substance that had entered the art museum organism. Defending his project, curator Edward Fry declared unequivocal support for, quote, the freedom and integrity of this or any other artist's work over and above any question of bureaucratic loyalty to an institution, end quote. Fry was promptly dismissed. To put this in context, the early 1970s was an extraordinary moment of social discontent, or what Herbert Marcuse labeled the Great Refusal. Specifically, Hawke's Guggenheim confrontation took place just a few years after the global student and worker uprisings of 1968, and only a few months before 500,000 people marched on Washington, D.C. to condemn the U.S.-led undeclared war in Vietnam, a conflict that was by then expanded by Nixon and Kissinger to include Laos and Cambodia. In addition, let's remember that 1970 was also in the United States when National Guards troops shot and killed unarmed students at Kent and Jackson State Universities, as well as when the New York art strike against racism, sexism, repression, and war took place as a form of massive protest. But I want to draw attention to what happened soon after Hawke's exhibition was officially canceled, when an unscripted, or maybe I should say semi-choreographed protest conga line took place, snaking its way down the ramp of the Guggenheim's Frank Lloyd Wright Fifth Avenue building, with artist and filmmaker Yvonne Rainier in the lead and other members of the Collective Art Workers Coalition, of which Hawke was a founding member, though he was not present that day, dancing close behind, hands upon one another's hips. Curiously, the converting intervention received scant attention at the time, and perhaps this is because, when compared to more familiar picket lines, this action was itself too artistic and potentially entertaining. Today, institutions like the Guggenheim are only too happy to invite similar performance works to unfold and warm up the cold modernist or sometimes brutalist interior architecture of many museums, while of course also improving ticket sales in a world hooked on distraction and spectacle. Though of course it could not be an improvised act of protest like Rainier and the Art Workers Coalition carried out in '71, because great care and planning is required not to avoid colliding with a museum goer, and more importantly, not to interfere with works on display. Many lent on the condition of absolute care and supervision. After all, insurance claims alone would easily cancel out the membership benefits of such an equation. But I hardly need to point out to you that staging social affectivity within a normally static visual art museum setting, including international biennales, has become something of a regular feature over the past few years. Think of all the performative projects created for the containable spaces within the Museum of Modern Art, its atrium, and of course the Tate's Turbine Hall. In fact, the newly renovated and reimagined Museum of Modern Art has even turned this combination of stillness and action into a sales pitch, stating, quote, from quietly contemplating a single work to watching live rehearsals in the Kravis studio, you'll find something unexpected and inspiring every time you visit. And then it goes on to list the shops and cafes that one will find inside this experiential palace. Meanwhile, the success of Anna Imhoff's Golden Lion winning project, Faust, performed at the German Pavilion of the Venice Biennale in 2019, complete with Doberman Pinschers, undoubtedly assures that the Biennale will continue its new performance art program, which takes place both inside and outside the Arsenale. So before digging into this in a more detailed way, let me draw out this contrast between past forms of art world social engagement and what has been taking place in recent years, especially in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis that arguably politicized so many artists and other creative workers who were already leading a precarious existence as part of the cultural sphere's so-called 99%. Briefly returning to the post-1968 situation, effectively after 1971, after this cancellation, Haka was blacklisted from most US museums, with the exception of the New Museum, though the high-profile Guggenheim cancellation also assured that his practice would henceforth shape what Aruna de Souza describes as, quote, the way subsequent generations of artists have understood the relationship between art and the social world. Artists continued to call attention to the allegedly neutral facade of the mainstream art world throughout the late 1960s and much of the 1970s, including in 1969 with Black Emergency Cultural Coalition's opposition to the Metropolitan Museum's Harlem on My Mind, an exhibition that did not include a single African-American artist, either living or dead. There were also picket lines set up outside the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1970 declaring "Women Now," demanding that more art institutional accountability for the low number of women artists exhibited. 1970 also saw the ad hoc Women's Committee of the Art Workers Coalition, a sort of faction of the group, Women Artists in Revolution, Women Students and Artists for Black Artist Liberation, the Guerrilla Art Action Group. All of these emerged around the time of 69 to 1971. These concerns and these activist practices tick up again around 1976 with the formation of Artists Meeting for Cultural Change, in some ways an offshoot of Art and Language. That group publishes their own anti-catalog that demonstrates the profound absence of women and people of color selected to represent 300 years of American art for the Whitney's bicentennial exhibition, which was effectively the personal collection of John D. Rockefeller, the Standard Oil baron, and the nation's first billionaire. After the 1980s, with the partial exception of the Guerrilla Girls, socially engaged artists sought out ways to work fully outside of or as far away from institutional frame of high art as possible. The AIDS activist group Grand Fury created public campaigns displayed as advertising on city buses. The neo-situationist tactical media artists such as Electronic Disturbance Theater and Critical Art Ensemble focused on interventions into digital and biological technologies, while community-based social practice artists such as Rick Lowe with his project Row Houses in Houston, Texas, or the maintenance artist Merrill Lederman Ukele's produced projects in collaboration with municipal agencies. But fast forward to the present moment, and after several decades of relative disinterest in treating cultural institutions as a site of protest, we find again a sweeping resurgence of direct engagement in the mainstream art world. This is especially so since the financial crisis of 2008, in which we find artists becoming increasingly engaged in a wide range of cultural activism. Much of it starting off as a means of addressing the art world's stupendously asymmetrical economic structure. This includes groups such as BFA, MFA, PhD, or Occupy Museums, or Debt Fair, or Working Artists in the Greater Economy, also known as WAGE. But soon after, it expands to include system-wide condemnation of high culture's institutional ties to neighborhood gentrification, the fossil fuel industry, pharmaceutical companies that push opioids, a call for the removal of toxic trustees with links to arms manufacturing, private debt investment, and so-called art-washed income. For example, British art collective Liberate Tate carried out 6 years of actions starting in 2010 in protest of the Tate Museum's petrodollar contributions from British Petroleum. This included dousing a volunteer with thick tar-like goo, an action that the group insisted was also an homage to Malevich's Black Square, painting that was part of an exhibition simultaneously featuring Malevich's work from the early avant-garde. Right? Though never acknowledging the success of such direct art activism on its donor policies, the museum announced an end to its affiliation with BP in 2016. Similarly, though with less of a conclusive outcome, Gulf Labor Coalition and Global Ultra-Luxury Faction, or Gulf, agitated against the Guggenheim Museum's planned Abu Dhabi facility in the United Arab Emirates, boycotting, publicly chastising, debating, and eventually intervening and occupying both the flagship New York Fifth Avenue location and Peggy Guggenheim House in Venice, Italy in 2015. But in 2017, work stopped on the new constructed new museum building, where treatment of migrant construction workers by the UAE is described by Human Rights Watch as seriously exploitative, with internal critiques of the regime silenced by imprisonment. Members of the Gulf Labor and Gulf Co groups were themselves put under surveillance and blocked from entry into the UAE, allegedly for security reasons around the same time. Given all of this good trouble, as the late John Lewis called his civil rights activism, let me return to my opening question to ask once again, why the embrace, sometimes awkward embrace perhaps, by mainstream institutions of socially engaged and activist art now? Here's a tentative checklist of possibilities. Naturally, we might first attribute this recent interest in radical art groups and activist art and collectivism to a new generation of art historians, critics, curators, and arts administrators expanding their range of sanctioned cultural production as they displace more object-oriented art world gatekeepers of another generation. And while no doubt this is one important factor, it implies conventional modes of top-down validation, a claim that this paper and myself and all of my work have sought to dispute. A second explanation hinges on the need for major cultural drivers, such as museums, biennials, and art collectors, to remain up to date with regard to new art world developments. And who could deny that the current and impressive wave of socially engaged art, with its myriad array of participatory projects, informal collectives, and racialized aestheticization, can only be ignored at the cost of irrelevance. Yet, while this is not entirely incorrect, it neither totally satisfies as an explanation, and nor is it strictly a new phenomenon. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, in a sense coming forward from this period of the 1960s and 70s, a series of high-profile exhibitions featured politicized and collective art practices, including the Museum of Modern Art's Committed to Print exhibition in 1988, as well as Group Material's Democracy Project, Martha Rosner's If You Lived Here, which took place between 88 and 89 at the Dia Art Foundation, and the 1993 Whitney Biennial, which was an exhibition that, despite its rather tepid effort at introducing audiences to socially engaged art, even managed to earn the disparaging label politically correct, in quotes. In sum, although art's social agency has repeatedly been forced into temporary visibility, usually as a response to extra artistic circumstances, as was in the case in the 1920s and 30s, and the 1960s and 1970s, and the late 1980s, and we could even go back to the turn of the century with the Russian Revolution, of course, the Mexican Revolution, it is just as rapidly submerged, again, out of sight. That is, once it appears, it seems to vanish, until it doesn't, or until it won't. and which is the situation I believe we've arrived at today, as the abstract and typically fragmented off-screen presence of cultural labor is materializing into distinct social agency. This has in turn led to a condition that, with apologies to philosopher Giorgio Agamben, I call our bare art world, one in which the presumed sovereignty and freedom of high culture has been stripped clean of its claim to autonomy, and in which the economic and political contradictions of art are becoming impossible to conceal, thus its nakedness. First, let's address a stubborn issue. Art was never the exceptional and autonomous human pursuit promised by so many art historians and aestheticians since at least the time of Schiller and Kant. This widely held view renders artistic production a unique mode of human labor, a type of work unmotivated by wages or capital or disciplinary authority. In a word, artistic autonomy came to define human freedom in an all too inviting romance of bourgeois idealism. But whether under capitalism or socialism or anarcho or libertarianism, what is defined as artistic culture is always mediated by institutional and ideological structures. And this mediation invariably assists, exploits, or appears to impede the work of the imagination, regardless if it is carried out by professionalized artists compelled to reject their administrative overlords in the name of freedom, or the anti-institutional labor of gritty, underground, street, or samizdat artists, or even those within the vast and unlit sphere of do-it-yourself, informal, and amateur arts. Forms of informal cultural practice that have become inescapable in recent times, thanks largely to the internet. And yet, what is significant today is that sometime in the late 1980s, the emerging neoliberal economy began subsuming the mythical attributes of artistic labor into the capitalist marketplace as never before. Imagination, creativity, and thinking, quote, outside the box became watchwords of the new economy. Previously ignored, suppressed, or feared, these volatile veins of effective value generated by everyday post-industrial life were mined and monetized. Inevitably, this knowledge and creativity exposed art's inherent social productivity. Paradox. And it did so far more profoundly than the wave of post-1968 social art historians and practitioners of institutional critique ever imagined, and as we will see in a minute. This dual process of artistic assimilation and institutional unconcealment began ramping up after the collapse of the socialist world in the early 1990s. In the United States in particular, high culture's nearly 50 years of service to the ideology of bourgeois individual freedom suddenly required a substantial reboot. By 1989, the necessity of promoting America's cultural freedom as an ideological contrast to their rival geopolitical hegemon, the Soviet Union, vanishes. And in its place, the National Endowment for the Arts will spend much of the 1990s shifting towards prioritizing utilitarian values, including the social impact of culture and community-based art programs. In other words, the end of the Cold War, art institutions in the US and in other capitalist nations scrambled to imagine and create a new paradigm that might grant continued state support, despite assertions that we had reached the end of history, to cite the neo-libertarian theorist Francis Fukuyama and his famous 1992 application of Hegel as the triumph of Western capitalism over the socialist East. I think he's since recounted this phrase and this thinking. Thus, privatization, marketization, position and propositions that museums might serve as a regional engines of economic co-productivity soon gave birth to projects such as the Guggenheim Bilbao, in the Basque Country in Spain, the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, both of which were dreamt up by former Guggenheim director Thomas Krenz, perhaps the first major museum director to hold an MBA from the Yale School of Management rather than a traditional doctorate in art history. I believe he had an undergraduate degree in art history. But Krenz's mission of harnessing contemporary art's alleged tourist dollar magnetism in order to spur economic growth in financially undeveloped regions became a parody of its own post-Cold War ambition when the Guggenheim Foundation announced the new museum franchise in Abu Dhabi, as I said before, a kingdom riven with human rights and migrant labor abuse. Nonetheless, the coup de grace for the notion of artistic autonomy really starts with the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the ensuing uprisings. Arab Spring, 15M movement in Madrid, Occupy movement, which soon becomes global. And artists identify very quickly with this idea of the 99%. In fact, artists often play key roles organizing these various occupations, even as contemporary art itself was being so conspicuously entwined with the laws of economic value production. In other words, ensnared in and by capital's increasingly rapid and reoccurring political reach, which means art also becomes involved in the crisis of capitalism itself, these reoccurring bubbles and bursts. Thus, a bare art world. As the late Randy Martin observes about the overall affect of neoliberal society, quote, if money was, even in the recent past, what people were thought to be most defensive about than any other subject, the veil, he writes, has in many ways been lifted, end quote. Stripped of all romance, this radically demystified bare art world was no doubt aided by decades of Marxist theorizing and institutional critique, but its delivery to us now, at this moment of ceaseless capitalist crisis, is largely the result of two forces. First, recession-hardened, post-Occupy, over-indebted artists on the one hand, and second, a seemingly irrefutable dose of reality offered up by the culture industry's own managerial elite on the other. And here we can think of many things, but not just the career of Thomas Krenz, but the current fascination with NFTs, non-fungible tokens. The art market, it's the art market auctioneer's answer to Bitcoin, right? Only the latest type of bare art bubble, which follows on the heels of art flipping, bundled art, asset investments, and so on and so forth. And if anybody wants to explain the NFT more clearly, please step in after I'm finished my talk. Bare art spreads across a meme-driven cyberspace, leaving high culture exposed and on par now with other objects and practices, as high culture's once fantastical privilege of autonomy plunges to earth, where it is submerged in a realm of dark matter, including tactical media, craftivism, do-it-yourself street art, and all the species of socially engaged and activist art that are emerging from this social agency that's been unleashed by the bare art world. And it's been always present with the art world, but now it's organizing, expanding, and spreading throughout institutional spaces. But significantly, while we witness a new surge of engaged artistic resistance on the outside or partially on the outside of institutions, we also find growing unionization movement on the inside. This is quite interesting to me. I think we can talk about this after, in which museum employees in the US seek better pay and working conditions, but also in many instances, they demand such extra financial improvements as an end to gender and racial workplace bias and greater overall respect for management and senior staff members towards junior staff people. Notably, many of these pro-union museum workers are themselves art-educated graduates with degrees in studio art and art history. This is, in other words, a generation schooled in the deconstruction of art world spaces and ideological facades by the likes of Michael Asher and Hans Haacke, followed by Andrea Fraser and Fred Wilson, and who, after some 50 years of institutional critique, are consciously, or perhaps more likely unconsciously, applying these lessons directly to their own precarious real art world circumstances. Except this new variant of institutional critique, if you will permit me this somewhat brazen characterization, is not manifest as works of art, or doesn't manifest itself in works of art, but instead involves an intervention by cultural workers for cultural workers. And here we have to think certainly the very term cultural worker has its own peculiar art world etymology, with roots in the 1930s, if I'm not mistaken, though much more frequently and problematically used by conceptualists and minimalists in the 1960s as a way to identify with the proletariat. Which is to say that today, art workers are merely art workers. And not just those who make up the creative class or the cognitariat, those part-time website designers and studio assistants with MFAs and so forth, but also the hundreds of highly educated, nominally paid museum employees who install exhibitions, write press releases, serve lattes and biscotti in the museum cafes, clean bathroom stalls, mop floors, and provide security for the multi-million-dollar objects that adorn the walls of the white cube citadels that is fine art. Think of this unsung army as a type of non-reflective dark matter, a sphere of cultural labor that has always been invisible within plain sight, even as it has maintained and reproduced the foundational logic of the high art industry, including its neoliberal permutation as enterprise culture. Therefore, what began as a demand for a fair slice of high art's cultural assets is also now weakening the always fraught boundary separating art and life, as if to demonstrate, in an echo of early avant-garde proclamations, that the gap between caring for objects and caring for the creative social well-being must henceforth be annulled. Complementing these internal contradictions of an increasingly naked art world is the external, more or less external, cascade of artists trying to escape the confines of high culture altogether. Some approach this escape by demanding a total decolonization of art and its institutions. For example, Gulf labor or decolonize this place. All of this might seem to be, at bottom, another instance of institutional critique, somewhat akin to the 13 demands made by Art Workers Coalition in 1969, in which the group stipulated that the art world must adapt a clear partisan position against racism, sexism, ecological degradation, and the war in Vietnam. But reforming the ideology of high culture, as was the case with Art Workers Coalition, the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, and Women Artists in Revolution in '69, is quite a different gambit from seeking the elimination of the entire foundation on which high culture rests. When the Congolese activist Mozala Diabanza recently and defiantly detached an ancient African artifact from its display pedestal at the Quai Branly Museum in Paris, and then proceeded to attempt and walk out of the building, all the while loudly proclaiming that, quote, "we want our riches back," the implication of this action is not, how do we rethink the ways that these mostly purloined objects can be better displayed and more correctly contextualized? No, the logical outcome of such decolonial thinking and deeds goes far beyond rearranging the deck chairs. It calls into question and calls into doubt the entire cultural paradigm of art inherited from the 19th century, including its implicit conviction that European, mostly Northern European and Anglo-American societies are uniquely suited to study, collect, and interpret the history and artifacts generated by themselves, but also by other peoples, even if these other peoples are located within their own national boundaries as cultural subgroups or migrants or refugees and so forth. Locally and globally, this set of assumptions is being called into question, with a corollary movement of monumenticide against the publicly celebrated legacy of white supremacy. Certainly, monument takedowns have a long and convoluted history, but these actions have been accelerating, especially since May 25, 2020, when George Floyd, an unarmed black man, was suffocated to death by Minneapolis police during an arrest. His death captured on a cell phone by a nearby witness. According to some research, the Citizens video documentation of Floyd's horrific asphyxiation was viewed some 1.4 billion times between the time of the assault and less than 2 weeks later on June 5th. 3 months later, close to 40 Confederate monuments in the United States were either officially removed or scheduled for removal, with many also taken down through acts of collective civil disobedience. This soon built upon a nearly global wave of monument takedown from South Africa to Belgium, from the Caribbean to the US, and also in the north of the US, in which memorials, statues, and other public tributes to white supremacist men, and sometimes women, were dethroned, toppled over, deformed, beheaded, tossed in streams, typically with the less easily available plinth or pedestal left behind, although now coded in graffiti that read George Floyd, or Black Lives Matter, or simply BLM. To my mind, these ostensibly bad deeds constitute an attempt to push back against the economic and political crisis and social crisis that has emerged certainly since 2008, but more emphatically following the 2016 Brexit and presidential elections. I'm writing now in the aftermath of 4 years of stupefying chaos, anti-government chaos from Washington, as well as a climax that occurred on January 6, 2021, when populist right-wing rioters broke out in the Washington, D.C. Capitol. I believe we have actually collectively entered into what I call the unpresent, a distinct mutation of capitalist realism, a concept, of course, made famous by the late Mark Fisher. For Fisher, capitalist realism was the aestheticization and so-called normalization of post-socialist, post-Cold War capitalism, a historically contingent condition, positing itself as the only imaginable reality. All alternatives to the system, so we are led to believe, have either faded, failed, or are now incorporated into capital's spectacularized hegemony as commodified lifestyle choices. Think of counterculture, punk, goth, hip-hop, the obvious examples, but also contemporary art and its faith in a reconstituted concept of the avant-garde. Capitalist realism's implicit promise was to offer in exchange for its unchallenged hegemony an assurance that periodic economic and political catastrophes would be followed by a return to business as usual. That is to say, a return to the familiar, if monotonous, terrain of capitalist realism. What makes the unpresent an unforeseeable variant of Fisher's thesis is the growing sense that our current crisis is not a temporary detour, but is instead a permanent pathological state from which any notion of past or future perceived to be fundamentally different, and especially perceived to be fundamentally better than the delirium of our current situation, has been so completely excised. More than this, fading fast into inaccessibility was even the memory that alternative possibilities once existed. Then came weeks of monumenticide last spring, a collective and highly social cooperative process of wounding or lacerating centuries of a certain dominant historical narrative. And despite the movement's attempt to fully erase public representations of white supremacy, colonialism, patriarchy, class oppression, paradoxically, its destructive negativity served to illuminate memory's lacuna by way of deletion. So in conclusion, both in the 1960s and early 1970s, as well as over the past decade, what typically began as an effort by cultural workers for equitable pay and greater security swiftly intensifies into a broader program of demands. And because of the forked genealogy of socially engaged art, ever since really maybe 1968, certainly the post-1968 era, with some practitioners attempting to jettison the art world and the avant-garde altogether in a move theorist Stephen Wright terms escapology, while another branch focused its attention on challenging the art world's internal doctrine of alleged economic and political neutrality. It is the legacy of this dual critique that now confronts, and in turn is confronted by, a radically denuded bare art world, one that is no longer capable of disguising its dependency on socialized forces of artistic production that maintain and reproduce its ideological architecture. Raucous public pageants, banner drops, giant puppets, politicized street performances, boycott campaigns, museum occupations, guerrilla monumenticides, demands that compromised individuals be removed from museum boards, and above all else, calls for a total decolonization of high culture suggest that the likely answer to my initial question involving the embrace of socially engaged art by mainstream art institutions is something akin to sympathetic magic, a sort of cargo cult effigy approach intended to hold at bay the far more consequential challenge that activist and socially engaged art agency represents to the art world's unvarnished status quo. To cite John Roberts, radical art internalizes, quote, the retroactive and non-linear latency of revolutionary time in order to unleash the present from the necessities of chronological time. As opposed to clever pop-up quizzes about radicalized art collectives that no longer pose, or at least appear to no longer pose, a threat, I keep thinking of recent COVID-era landscapes dotted with empty monument pedestals, objects collectively transmuted from remnants to revenants. What have these emptied support structures for these monuments become? They're now vacant. They're like perches made of broken concrete or marble, sometimes revealing bare and rusted anchoring bolts jutting up and out of their graffiti-covered surfaces. Weird, uncanny things that keep dragging our eyes and thoughts and sense of identity back over to the holes torn into a surplus archive of cultural time. And it is there, in this incision, that we glimpse a version of the past that once sought to convince us about a seemingly unconflicted world and its stable social hierarchies, but which now speaks to us about our bad new days of unsettled delirium and crisis and unstoppable, buoyant rebellion. Thank you.